Shalom for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. Um, I am excited once again to be coming to you here on this Shabbat. And it's interesting because the magnitude of this message does not equate the energy that I currently am experiencing, nor is it equate to the kind of the run-of-the-mill presence that generally speaking, I have experienced this Sabbath. I mean, like there was no updates, there was no drama. I'm like, maybe they don't know that I'm going to speak this message today? Because usually, if there's going to be a message with magnitude, it's going to be, it's going to be intense. So, um, well, so let's see. Let's start at the beginning. First and foremost, last week, we talked a little bit about the descendancy of Torah versus ascendancy of Torah. And we talked about the ascendancy and descendancy of energy and the idea that there's always a cost and there's always a kind of an emptiness that occurs as you pour out, etc. Well, I want to talk a little bit or a moment about the idea that the commandments of God, as you understand, if I'm using the G word, you understand that I am speaking to an audience who doesn't yet understand Elohim. But the commandments of God in general are perceived to be a written set of rules accompanied by oral traditional interpretation of those rules and therefore traditions, right? And not a whole lot of people have their minds wrapped around everything that goes into that process when it comes to becoming a Shomer Torah, right? Shomer Torah is guardian of Torah, okay? So when we are working with that model of a Shomer Torah, generally speaking, the way that you want to think about it is guardians of Torah tend towards the function of order, okay? Now, order itself has its origins in the Hebrew word for order, which is light interpreted in English. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is actually a Hebrew understanding that the word or light has its principle of setting something in sequence. Okay. For example, let's say that you have a box of rocks, you put them into a container, or I mean you have a bunch of rocks, you put them into a box. And as you're putting them into the box, you're kind of setting them in such a way that they don't touch each other and that they are kind of all together in there, but they're not necessarily touching each other, and therefore they're not going to, clink together or anything like that. Okay, so that's my illustration for that. But the premise is that that's order. Okay, so what can we conclude from that? Well, order has some sort of limitation upon the opposite of order, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, so in terms of Christianese, we need to dispense with some words. So first of all, when I say God, what I mean is the energy of order, okay? Or it can be the energy of disorder. I'll explain that in a minute. When I say disorder, I mean absolute chaos. The way a Christian American Protestant would understand chaos, even though that is a Greek god and it should not be upon my lips, just as much as there was probably nobody who was a self-respecting Jew during the time of Yeshua who would have used the word Hades, right? Because it's a Greek god to describe the underworld, if there was an underworld, which there is not. Okay, so in that principle, it is important to understand that when I talk about disorder, I am not talking about a process of dysfunction within a human being. Okay, I'm not talking about like, for example, a mental disorder or a disorder of the organs. I'm not necessarily talking about that. I'm talking about something way more vast, and I will explain that in a minute. So Yahweh goes to Job, right, and says, okay, look, I actually need some counsel about some things. So if you would do me a favor, I actually have some prerequisites first. For example, when I told the waters they could go no further, were you there? Or when I actually, measured the length of the earth, were you there? You know what I mean? Those kind of things. And of course, Job's like, oh, my bad, right? Covers his mouth, does not speak. When we're thinking about the vastness of the intensification of all power in the universe, one of the more necessary discussion topics would be water. And of course, we began this Elohim series talking about water originally. We established that there were multiple Elohim, and that one of the Elohim that had creative powers was water. We know because the intensification of all power in the universe commanded water to bring something forth from nothing, right? So we know that he commanded the waters to create, to cause to come into existence. We, of course, also have that ability and power and assert that on a regular basis as we procreate. But there's something interesting about water. There's a principle of water that is very powerful and needs to come into play with this discussion about Torah. And it's simply this. If you take water and pour it out, okay, when it's in a container, it has limitation, technically has shape. In fact, if you froze it like that, it would hold that shape. That's how we make ice cubes. But the premise is that really water, no matter what, is always trying to move. Now you say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like reality, because we know that really what's happening there is if we remove the limitation, the water is pulled by gravity down into wherever it's going. Well, okay, I'll go with that. But remember, water is an Elohim. You say, well, how is water an Elohim when it was actually the sea that the intensification of all power in the universe commanded us, or commanded it to bring forth, right? Well, here's the intriguing thing about this. With the exception of the water vapor that is above us in the clouds, and I really could go down to the quantum level and connect those as well. But if you think about it, the same water that is present at the top of the mountain as it begins to trickle down the mountain and become a tributary to river is the same water that's present in the ocean. What do I mean by that? There is a constant connection all the way up to that moment, to that point where the snow is melting and becoming rivers, and rivers are flowing into the sea. There is never a interruption between that point of melting and that point in the ocean. In that way, for that part of the water cycle anyways, there is an absolute connection between the sea and the water. Therefore, we accept that any water is Elohim. Now, dropping down to the quantum level, we can connect the snow to the clouds, et cetera, like because there's actual water molecules in the air, and therefore there's a connection there as well. But when we accept that all water is an Elohim, then we understand that however much it is influenced by gravity, and so we're going to accept our physical science, but then we're going to attach our metaphysical and subtle science into this. And the metaphysical subtle science says that water is alive, that it is actually an Elohim, that it has intelligence, and that it has a very specific way in which it operates. And I'm going to propose that every Elohim has the same characteristic, and therefore we're going to find some amazing things out about Torah. Okay? And that's going to result in something even more powerful, which we will discuss after that. So really, this is a foundation. So starting with our foundation, in its simplicity, water follows the path of least resistance. Well, if limitations prevent water from flowing a certain way and cause water to flow a different way, in other words, water is following the path of least resistance, electricity is following the path of least resistance. Again, Paul's saying we can learn from our Elohim, our higher authorities of emanation from the intensification of all power in the universe. We can learn from that. We can learn from water and from electricity how energy actually works, how Elohim actually work, how Yahweh works, how the intensification of all power in the universe works. You say, well, what's the difference between the intensification of all power in the universe and Yahweh? It's simple. The moment that we assigned husband, father, son to the intensification of all power in the universe, we put limitations, which when I say we, I mean all of existence. So, I mean, it's not like we are the actual ones who created Yahweh Elohim. But our necessity to have a presence that we could perceive in our finite minds was absolutely a process that's our fault. You'd say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, in its simplicity, that energy coming down to us needs to be tangible, perceivable. In fact, oftentimes when people are laying hands on people and there's a transference of energy, and before you get too caught up in that thought process, please understand, you cannot have the disciples or Yeshua or Paul having energy move and be in denial of energy. You can't have both. You can either believe the scripture or you can believe your presuppositions about the Bible. Okay? So somewhere along the lines, we need to accept energy exists. And for those who have not experienced energy, that's a pretty difficult action, isn't it? Because experiential knowledge overrides written or claimed knowledge and definitely overrides intuition. Okay, so let's see if we can get our minds wrapped around this thought process. The intensification of all power in the universe, as it reduces itself in order to become something that we actually perceive not only as an authority, but for relationship. Why? Because relationship is at the core of benevolence. Why do I say that? Well, if we look at the etymology of relationship, we have a lateral returning to a stimulus that is benevolent. Malevolent energies trash relationships. Benevolent energies build relationships. Any relationship that exists results in like kind attracting like kind of some sort. Opposites do not attract. But the premise is that we think opposites attract because of magnetism, right? Well, I'm going to propose to you that that's a very different process and a very different thought on how that all works. But generally speaking, something you have in common and benevolence all combine to create relationship. Why is that important? Well, because when we're dealing with the intensification of all power in the universe, the moment we get into limitation, we have a perceivable, identifiable, anthropomorphic analogy of what our God is and what that energy is. Notice I use the G word because we're going back to that thought process of Sky Daddy, right? Something up higher. We look up, right? When really there is no up. And we're going to talk about up later on. And so in principle and in premise, what we need to understand then is what is the function of limitation and what's its purpose and how does it work? Because if you watch the Renewing Your Mind series, you would notice that one of the claims I make is that one of the things that's preventing you from being an effective human being are limiting beliefs. But at the same time, we do have this function of limitation creating order. So let's talk about that. Okay. So if you have a pitcher of water, it's inside of a container and therefore has limitations around it. But what is the potential of that water? The potential of that water is that if it's poured out and released, it will go follow the path of least resistance into every single last little nook and cranny and crevice and will always flow downward, right? And in that process of flowing downward, it does not ask permission. It does not propose its path, right? It does not ask whether you believe in it or not. And it definitely will only divert itself away from resistance. Okay. So then from that perspective, we now see the difference between order, which is the limitation preventing the water from being in a state of what? Disorder, which I will repeat one more time, is the American Protestant Christians' chaos, right? Which is this concept of just absolute randomness and movement without permission in all these different directions without limitation, right? Okay. So as this water has the tendency and always wants to be in a state of disorder, the only way in which we can bring it into order is through containment. And that containment is a limitation. Now, why do we harness water? Why do we create the limitation in the first place? Absolutely, necessity is the mother of all invention. We require water as part of our process to create adenosine triphosphate. We need water as part of that process to rob the hydrogen molecules off of, because we need the hydrogen for the electron transfer chain. Okay. But the premise is in all of that, we have harnessed water from the beginning, carrying it in buckets, carrying it in goat skins, cupping it with our hands and bringing it up to our face. We have harnessed this Elohim with absolute intention and understanding that it is a need or a necessity. Now, here's the intrigue of need and necessity. Need and necessity are actually a fear. Now, I won't get too far into that because we probably are going to save that for the Imagination mini-series, which is part of the Renewing Your Mind series that we are slowly working through as I receive more intuition to continue with it. Now, having said that, here's the importance. Necessity is a fear of emptiness, right? A fear of that deficit not being fulfilled. Therefore, we say, okay, I'm going to harness this water to consume it, right? And we know also that that water brought forth the fish of the sea, the swimmers that swim, right? And the tanim, the dragons. And that's a whole nother story as well. Okay, so now here is the import. When we are dealing with this Elohim, we are learning something very important about descendancy. Descendancy operates in a state of absolute disorder. And only through harnessing it do we actually experience, or only through a limitation do we actually experience that process. Now, the reason why this is important is because eventually we're going to understand how and why Torah has the evolvement, as it were, that it does, the way that it evolves. Now, the intrigue is in the fact that when we hear the law, if we are a Protestant American Christian, we have a tendency to say that is tyranny. We have a tendency to say that is a burden that our forefathers could not carry, right? They try to claim that that's what Peter was saying at the Jerusalem Council, when the truth is circumcision has nothing to do with Torah. It has to do with the custom of Moses, and we can talk about that. But the premise is that circumcision is an identification proof that you are what? Of the tribe of Abraham, and therefore have rights to the Holy Land, to the Promised Land, which consequently, expanding its borders, becomes the entire earth. But that's another story as well. I know I'm offering you a lot of other stories today, but I have to be careful not to chase too many tangents, because of what we need to really, really get our minds wrapped around. And so, path of least resistance, if something follows the path of least resistance, it's actually in disorder. As we harness it to create limitations on it in order to create conduits by which it moves, or create canals by which it flows, etc., etc. For example, here in our city, we actually have a huge rolling dam diversion of the Colorado River to bring irrigation water into the three main areas of the city. And therefore we have three main canals, but each one of those canals are all operating off of the idea of these rolling dams then causing water to divert Roman aqueduct style into our various communities. Again, harnessing this Elohim by creating limitation, right? And then that water is then delivered to the areas that have need of irrigation and drinking water, right? And then they go through the water treatment facilities, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so the premise that we really need to accept is that an Elohim in its greatest operation will be completely disordered, out of order. It will not have limitation, and it will follow the path of least resistance. An Elohim in a contained or limited capacity can then be channeled and or can be harnessed for use. However, I will remind you that an Elohim wants to tend towards the path of least resistance to begin with. Okay, so now what we need to do is accept that any attribute or any flow of energy from an Elohim is going to follow that same path. Now, the reason why that is important is because at the focal point of an Elohim's potential and purpose is a limitation because of harnessing and an intention of the path of least resistance. So I know that there's probably a thought in your mind, oh my gosh, you are claiming that anytime that an Elohim is operating in its fullest potential, they are in a state of disorder, right? A state of, the CH word. So the focus or concept then is why place limitations on it, and what are those limitations? Well, let's go first from the point of view of what would happen if it didn't have those limitations, right? So if we were dealing with water, let's say that we just go ahead and, step into the monsoon season, drill a big old hole in the top of your roof, and just let the water come, right? Drill a hole in the top of your roof. Oh, wait, what's the roof? Resistance, right? Your roof, rain, resistance. Hole in the roof, rain follows path of least resistance. Now you have what? You have disorder. You have damaged paint, damaged wood, damaged flooring, damaged linoleum for most of us, and damaged, mold and mildew, which of course are a violation of Torah. Technically, you're supposed to set the place on fire and cover it with stones, but that's another story as well. So in principle, as we are focusing on the thought process of this thing following the path of least resistance, we understand that in general, Elohim follow the path of least resistance until there's a limitation, and that limitation creates some sort of harnessing, and that harnessing is for a purpose. In other words, energy moves without permission in every given direction. Once we start to harness that energy and we channel it into, say, wires, or we channel it into, say, pipes, which technically is the same thing, we are using it for a purpose. It still wants to flow. We are just diverting some of it into purpose, okay? For example, your kitchen faucet, from the rolling dam, from the snow at the top of the hill, from the clouds that came from the sea when they got too hot, and there's the whole water cycle. You can give your kids science credit if you're homeschooling. Okay, so the premise is that now what we need to do is we need to assign an understanding concerning the things that are actually contained within that harnessing. Remember what I said, water is connected to other water. The sea brought forth life, but the sea is also connected to the entire water cycle. And therefore, in that way, the water that's coming out of your faucet as purpose is actually the same water that created the swimmers that swim and the tanin. And so in principle, the way that I want you to think about this is that containment does not equate to a reduction in potential. And containment does not equate to a reduction in intention, okay? The intention of water is to what? Flow to other water, right? That's the principle. That's why it's following that path of least resistance and eventually arriving at these huge bodies of water. And everything is trying to find its way to that moment. You say, well, wait a minute, this all has to do with gravity. Okay, fine, we'll stick with the earth sciences, and you can take your Bible and drop it in that little round basket beside your desk. Or we can take that back out and we can accept that Paul said that that's supposed to be teaching us something about what? Invisible attributes, divine nature, and eternal power. Paul's words in English, but Paul's words. And so when we're dealing with this, the way that I want you to think about it is as we deal with this idea of path of least resistance, we are dealing with disorder. In other words, it begins in disorder. Well, that's like something to do with, I don't know, thermodynamics or something like that, right? Everything begins in disorder and tries to tend towards order, tries to settle, tries to tend towards a containment, as it were. Well, what's interesting about that is that means that once water is contained or limited for a purpose, during that limitation, it accepts its purpose. Remember, water is an Elohim, and it doesn't necessarily have to accept its purpose as drinking water or water for the fish aquarium or water for the puppy, right? Okay, but the premise is that it accepts its purpose. Okay. So when I say that something contained, an Elohim that is contained for purpose, is contained for purpose because of the idea that there is some benefit from it. Necessity created the necessity, need created the necessity to what? To harness water. We got thirsty. And when we got thirsty and we harnessed water, that's the moment when what? When containment and purpose was created. So when an Elohim is in a process of just spreading out in all directions without limitation, we need to understand that any containment of that Elohim is for a purpose, and containment of that Elohim as a purpose has the intention of benefit. Okay. Now, when we are dealing with an Elohim and all of its intensification, we are dealing with what? We are dealing with all of the information contained within that Elohim. The only information that's missing is that from the upper worlds, because why? There was a concentric reduction in all elements and reality of that emanation. For example, if we were to deal with, say, the knowledge of the upper worlds, we don't have that knowledge. In fact, when Paul went to the third heaven, we know that he said what? He said, I can't utter what I experienced there, right? Things I can't speak of, right? So there's hidden knowledge or olam knowledge, or in the English, everlasting knowledge, right? Okay, so when we're dealing with that thought process, what we understand is that all information contained within the Elohim is only what the Elohim has the potential to know at this level, unless there's an elevation to a higher level of Elohim. That's a whole nother discussion because we're talking about descension today. And so when we're dealing with this idea of descension, we are also dealing with this function or idea that once harnessed and contained, all the attributes of that Elohim are still present. Containing it does not take away from its intensity. Containing it channels its intensity through a conduit. Okay? Now, the reason why that's important is because if we're dealing with the actual Elohim from the intensification of all power in the universe that is contained within the attributes or the what we could potentially call the seven spirits of God, we need to really, really, really accept that that information is still present all the way through the process. Okay? Why is it important? That means that every breath, right? Which we'll talk about in a minute. Every drop of sweat, every every function of reality contained within the existence of that Elohim is that Elohim. Now, I know that there is probably a thought process that becomes dysfunctional in your mind that, wait a minute, how does that work? Because eventually we start to get into the question of, if an Elohim is split off into different things, how is it that it's still one Elohim? Well, let's take a look at that. So let's start at the beginning. What do we have? We have in the world of formation. How do we know it was the world of formation? Because it starts with, and he formed, right? This is Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Let's go ahead and read that. And while we are looking that up, let me say that there are 4 worlds of creation, and that those 4 worlds of creation contain different attributes that are necessary to understand what body we are dealing with. Because I think there's a problem, or there is a tendency to believe that this body is the only one that exists or matters. Okay. So for you video gamers, this next part's going to be kind of fun. So let's see. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 7, verse 2, and we'll go ahead and leave it in the King James Version. I actually would like to put it in the Young's literal translation, but a lot of you don't have that. We'll leave it in King James because, generally speaking, that will give us a good literal translation. My least favorite version of the Bible, probably one of the most corrupted versions of the Bible, but let's go with it. And Yahweh Elohim formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and Adam became a what? Nefesh Chaim, a Nefesh Chaim. Okay, let's go look at this in the interlinear for just a moment. The first word we're looking for is this one, and you'll notice it is in the third person masculine singular, right? And he did, and actually it is in what we call the cow, which means it's completed. He completed, right? And he completed. And the reason why that is imperfect, oh, by the way, where it says type sequential imperfect, ignore the sequential. That's kind of a linguistic interpretation that has some bias behind it. But the premise is that basically what it's saying is that something will follow. So he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this, right? Okay, so in this way, what we need to accept is that the Vav, which is right here, actually alters time, okay? So this actually says, he will form. But when we put the and on it, it's and he formed, and it's creating a change in time from an incomplete action to a complete action. The only reason I'm showing you that is so that you understand a little bit why there's that extra yod and that vav there. But the word that we're looking for is actually this word yatsar. Yatsar. And the realm of yatsar, you need to understand the realm of yatsar has 2 very important elements to it. Number 1, what you have is what you can use. There are no other elements present that you can use except what is already present. Okay, there's a difference between that in the world of Asiya or Asa and the world of Atzilut and the world of Bariya, which is intensification versus movement of energies, etc., etc. But this realm, height, width, depth, time, is all about the presence of material existence. How do we know? Because it says, and God formed out of the dust of the ground. The ground had to exist already. Adamah or dirt had to exist already. Adumah is not an Elohim. Aretz is an Elohim. Let Aretz bring forth the trees, etc., etc., etc. So the world of Yetzirah then is about formation, and that's why we call it the world of formation. Now, the reason why that's important is because when we look at Yetzirah, we start to understand that it is about forming something. Okay, let's get back to our verse. So the idea is he Yetzar. He forms, right, man, Adam, of the dust of the ground. Okay, but here's the part. And breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Okay, now, couple things we need to understand here. For example, when it says that there's a pleasing aroma to Yahweh Elohim, does he have a nose? No, doesn't. It's impossible because he's not part of this world of formation. Okay. Now, some people would like to create a Christophany and force Christ into human form, and therefore that's what nostrils experience the pleasing aroma. Well, there's a few problems with that we're not going to get into because I got no time to be chasing that tangent. But what we do need to understand is that the idea of nostrils is definitely a world of formation process, and the anthropomorphic assignment to Yahweh's nostrils is idiomatic and therefore allegoric, metaphoric, however you want to put it, not the actual literal nostrils of some dude with a long old beard sitting on some ivory throne up in the sky. Okay? Let that go. All right. But when we're dealing with Adam, we do have nostrils, right? And so from that point of view, when it says, and breathed the breath of life, okay? Breathed the breath of life, we are dealing with what? The neshama, right here. Neshmat, from the root neshama, right here, okay? Neshama. So when we read that, and God formed, breathed in the breath of his nostrils, etc., we are dealing with neshama, the breath or the spirit of God. Now, why is that important? Well, there's a few reasons. The first is that you live and move and have your being as a result of the neshama. There is no existence of a soul and therefore life without the neshama. The neshama is what actually causes you to be anything other than a pile of mud. Okay? The neshama itself is just like how the water is connected from the ocean all the way back to the snow. And if we go to the quantum level, all the way back to the clouds, and we go to the quantum level, all the way back to the ocean, and there's no separation in water anywhere in that process. So also in the neshama is the full extent of the information and potential of the intensification of all power in the universe. Why did I say potential? Because the moment he dialed himself back, he created a limitation and therefore purpose. And that purpose was a vessel of reception that could receive the benevolent energy or the energy of benevolence from the intensification of all power in the universe. The desire to connect to something created that first vessel. That vessel, in realization that it could never attain to the light, but had to stay a lesser with the light, therefore what? The receiver of the light then concentrized, right? Or what? Had a contraction, and that contraction created what? Another Elohim, and that other Elohim could never attain to that Elohim in its existence in the sense of what it was. Now, eventually there could be an elevation and that could arrive at that Elohim, but there's plenty more infinitely downward that are trying to work its way up, but it could never attain to that 100% Elohim because that would be the intensification of all power in the universe and nothing would exist. Therefore, the limitation placed upon the first contraction created a channel and therefore created a use of purpose. And that use of purpose, and then of course had that contraction, and therefore that concentricity occurred, and that concentricity then became an Elohim in and of itself with limitation and therefore purpose. Okay, and we have that same principle going all the way down to us. But the neshama is from the intensification of all power in the universe. Okay? How do we know that? Because it says, and the Lord God, right? So we know Yahweh is an Elohim. Yahweh is the perceivable God. For you who still speak Christianese, it is the perceivable God, the imperceivable God. Above that, we cannot fathom. Therefore, Yahweh is the first contactable, relationship-oriented process of the intensification of all power in the universe. And therefore, Yahweh Elohim is the highest Elohim that we could ever experience in this current world of formation, and really in all of our potential without ascension, which we will talk about. So why is that important? Because neshama is following what? The path of least resistance. And as resistance gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, it's entering dust of the ground, which I've always said there are three things that scare me in the scripture. One is the tehom. One is tehom being the abyss, and translated in English. Two is the dust of the ground, and three is Matthew 7:21. But the premise is that in all of that function, there was a beginning in disorder. And once a limitation was placed on that disorder, then purpose existed. That purpose was driven by that limitation. And as that purpose was driven by that limitation, then there was a new function of that Elohim. Okay, so when it says, and he formed Adam from the dust of the ground, breathed breath of life into his nostrils, then we also understand that any action of breath, right, that is mentioned in scripture needs to be understood as a function of that energy at a very high level. In other words, when it says that the word of God was breathed, right? That it was breathed, then we understand that it was the process of blowing air across voice coils, right? Across your voice box to create vibration. And that vibration then became something other than just breath. What does that mean? That means that breath, harnessed by a limitation, now creates vibration. Okay? The limitation placed upon the Elohim of breath. Why do I call it an Elohim? Because remember, all information, all attributes, all parts of the Elohim, no matter how separated they become, is still that Elohim. What does that mean? That means that neshama being present within Adam is still the intensification of all power in the universe, and with limitation, the vibrational breath of the intensification of all power in the universe, which at the higher levels is just simply energy. How do we know? Because there is no solids at those higher frequencies. There's no solids. Solids are a lower frequency process. We know that from science, that the lower the frequency, the higher the mass, right? That's the principle. And so when we're working with really, really high frequencies that obviously we can't even hear, docs can't even hear, When we're dealing at those high frequency vibrations or oscillations, we are dealing with a very different kind of science. We're dealing with the science of energy at its highest level, right? We're not dealing with the speed of sound or the speed of light anymore. We're dealing with the speed of thought, and maybe even faster than that. Maybe it's something we can't fathom the speed of. But the principle is that at that speed is how all of this is going into its process of function. Now, the reason why that's important is because when we're dealing with the limitation of the Word of God, we need to understand that that's an anthropomorphic assignment to the energies that are actually existing there. In other words, the neshama is the Word of God. The very thing that gives you life, that causes you to live and move and breathe and have existence, is the Word of God. How do we know that? Well, first of all, we have our buddy John saying, hey, look, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, right? That's that concept of an Elohim contains all the information, attributes, and existence as the intensification of all power in the universe. And so in that way, there is this premise that when you are dealing with the neshama, you're actually dealing with the Torah. Now, I won't go there yet. So now what do we understand? Torah is the teaching and instruction of Yahweh, right? Okay, let's go ahead and leave that alone for a moment because I don't want to go there yet, but I just want to mention that one element. Now, getting back to water, electricity, following the path of least resistance, we need to understand that the intention of Torah, the intention of instruction, is coming from the intensification of all power in the universe that has no limitations and has no intention of doing anything other than giving benevolence or a force of benefit. Okay? Now, I want to show you a scripture, and that verse that I want to show you is actually in Torah. So the way that I'm going to do this, so that you can actually learn how to do this, is I want you to go to your Blue Letter Bible app or whatever Bible app and search for the word commandment. Okay, and Abraham. Oh, I spelled commandment wrong. Fun times. All right. And so when we're looking at this, all right, let's try commands instead of commandment. Commands. Nothing. Okay. So let's see. How about Abraham? This is why I was going to do this, is because I want to be able to nail down this verse. Can't remember where it's at, right? Abraham and obey. Nope. Obedient. Okay. How about obeyed? There it is. That's the one I was looking for. Yep. What happened? I think that just timed out. Abraham and obeyed. And maybe I should have just did Abraham and obeyed my laws, but this is the verse we were looking for. Okay, that's twice that's happened now. Anyways, Abraham obeyed. At least we know that we can search that, right? Okay, and then we're going to Genesis 26:5. All right, here we go. Because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now, before we get an idea in our heads concerning that verse, that Abraham audibly heard the intensification of all power in the universe, right? Or at least the perceivable God, Yahweh Elohim, we need to look at one other verse when we're talking about the call of God. Okay. So we're going to be going to Genesis chapter 3, verse 17. Now it says what? It says, and unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife. Okay, that's horrible. Let's go ahead and go to the NLT here. Because since you listened to your wife and ate from the tree. Okay, I like that because that kind of gives the idea that Eve said something, but she didn't, did she? No, she gave him, and he ate. Why? Because he was present, right? That's what it says. Let's go back to verse 6, right? The woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. And then Yahweh says, because you listened to the voice of your wife. Okay, now there's a bunch of ways we could go about this. Number one is that there's no biblical actual recollection or reference or remembering in Torah that Eve spoke to Adam. But we do know that Adam ate the fruit when she gave it to him. And so if we go with that he listened to her voice, we accept that he listened to what? Her influence. Okay? Influence. I'm going to explain that in a minute. Or we could even go with intuition. In other words, the wife's heart, this is just a minor tangent. The wife's heart can sway the husband through influence. In fact, it even says, wives, submit to your husbands, for in doing so, you may win them without words. Win them to what? Not going to get into that today. But the premise is that is that concept of without words, or what? A voice that has nothing to do with vibration from air passing over a voice box. Okay? All right. So when we're dealing with this idea of voice, let's go back to Genesis chapter 26. And again, you saw we had to search for that to get to it. Because why? Because we know, okay, let me say something here real quick. You know how Paul is like, it's written in some place, right? I did you the favor of helping everybody, including myself, know the verse that we need to quote here. But it's written in some place that Abraham, what? Obeyed the voice of God, right? Okay, now we go into this. I will do this because Abraham listened to me and obeyed all my requirements and commands. Nah, we need to go back into the King James. Actually, let's go Young's literal on this one, right? Because that Abraham hath hearkened. Oh my gosh, hearkened. Is hearkened even a word in this day and age? To my voice, and keepeth my charge, my commands, my statutes, and my laws, right? So, and we know that is actually where we get the promise in verse 4. I have multiplied thy seed as the stars of heavens. I have given to thy seed all these lands, and blessed themselves in thy seed have all the nations of the earth. Okay. Yep. Okay. So, and all that because why? Because Abraham hath hearkened to my voice and keepeth my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. Now, going into the Hebrew, we can see that this word is shomer. Shomer. I'm sorry, shomer, right? Let's see, let's go boop right here from the word shamar, which means to guard, right? To guard. Okay. Why is that important? Because what we need to understand is that a voice begins at the intensification of all power in the universe is not right? It's not vibrations created by breath passing over a voice box. Nonetheless, it is vibrational. Nonetheless, it is influential. Nonetheless, it is intuitional. Okay. In other words, it has something to do with intuitional knowledge, right? Spiritual knowledge. Okay. So why do we know that this is going to be a difficult process for Abraham? Because he doesn't have the written word of God. Okay? So let's get this going in our brains now. Let's go back to our verse, and specifically, we're going to look at the last word in this verse right here, right? Vetorati, vetorati. From what? From Torah, right? From Torah, law. And so now what we need to understand is the voice of God, not breath passing over voice coils, but an intuition is what? Is Torah. The voice of God is Torah. Now, Paul actually brings this up. He uses Gentiles as an example twice in his letter to the Pharisees in Rome. He says, brethren, you who are Jews who know the law, right? I speak to those who know the law, right? He says, you call yourselves a guide to the blind. Who's that? The Pharisees and specifically rabbis. So he says that, but do you rob temples, blah, blah, blah. But then he says, guys, if a Gentile, though not having the law, a Gentile, what? Is not circumcised, not permitted in the synagogue, not given any opportunity, unless they're no hide Gentile, which is a whole nother story, is not in the synagogue, not learning Torah, does the things of Torah, then he shows that they are a Torah unto themselves. That's a weird statement. And then what? That the Torah has been written upon their hearts and that their conscience would defend them or excuse them at Yom Kippur. Okay, now that's important because when we are dealing with the function of Torah, we have a tendency to think Jewish laws. Torah does not make you Jewish because what was Abraham? Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldeans. Do you guys know what a Chaldean is? It's a magician. It's a worker of magic. And in principle, Ur of the Chaldeans is the city of the magicians. Right? And so now Abraham, who is clearly not related to Yahweh Elohim through any process of obedience, is told by him to go to a place that he would show him. And when he went to that place, that he would leave his family, right? Okay, so that being the case, what do we have? We have Abraham listening to the Torah that was written upon his heart before Torah was ever written down. He obeyed Torah. because it was the voice of Yahweh, which is not a vibration as a result of breath passing over voice coils, but instead is an intention, which consequently originates from the intensification of all power in the universe, whose pure intention and only intention was benevolence, the desire to give, not receive, the desire to give. And in that process, have a returning of that vessel of reception to receive again and again and again into a time beyond our understanding. So if the force of benefit, this is where James says all good things come down from the Father of lights, we acknowledge and understand what he was saying there was that everything begins in benevolence. Everything. All existence of creation begins in benevolence, a desire to give to a lesser who's willing to receive. Right? Okay. And so that premise then creates the entire model for an understanding that as it passes, remember I talked about filters, as it passes through filters, it becomes something else. So now it arrives at Abraham as what? A force of benefit that is an intuition, an inner voice, as it were, that guides him away from what? Away from famine, away from lack and decrease, away from a lack of water, away from, remember, he follows the water, right? How many times did Abraham dig a well, right? And so when we are dealing with this, we need to understand that the intensification of all power in the universe sends as a force of intention benefit, right? But as it passes through the filters of limitation, and those filters of limitation are based upon need and necessity, it is finally contained and arrives at purpose, which is what? Instruction to what? To offer the greatest form of benefit to who? Humanity. Not the Jews. But when humanity rejected it, remember, Abraham hearkened my voice and keepeth my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws, right? He guarded my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Shomer Torah, right? A guardian of Torah. Now, when we are dealing with the intensification of all power in the universe, we don't think, we can't think, we can't even really fathom it, but we're going to try to assign it some attributes. And as we do, what we are accepting is that by the time that force of benevolence gets to us, it is Torah. The same breath that gives you life is the same breath that gives you instruction. And it was never written on a piece of paper for you. It was what? It was first your breath of life. Your very contains Torah, contains the intuition to move in the direction of benefit, contains the intuition to move in the direction of perfection, contains the intuition to move towards the bullseye. Now, here's the intrigue. Most people think that sin, which is what? The absence of. That's the Latin word for absence of, is a function to prove your faultiness or your valuableness, or better yet, your imperfections. But the truth is that Torah and the actual action of sinning tells you how close you are to the bullseye. Okay? So, in that sense, it is very important to understand that the commandment itself is a force of benefit in your life that creates limitation upon the intensification within you to benefit you and to benefit others. What is the general theme of Torah? Social justice, or better yet, social injustice. What do I mean by that? I mean that Torah is the counter action or the antithesis of social justice. You say, well, wait a minute here. Doesn't it say we can own slaves? Doesn't it condemn those who make lifestyle choices? Blah, 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 blah. And I say this. If you choose, again, to believe the Bible, then you need to accept that that is impossible, right? You need to accept that us modern day American Protestant Christians, unfortunately, don't have the whole story, but also have an English version of the Hebrew, which is definitely not English, definitely not Greek. It's based upon a lifestyle, a culture, a thought process that is not present in America today. Not present. Okay. So why is it important? Because you either believe it or you don't. If you don't, throw it in the wastebasket. If you do, then you need to accept that it is a force of benefit in your life from cover to cover. Not just the New Testament, which is a Gnostic, Marcionian, Augustinian distortion of the interpretation of Torah, but instead is actually a force of benefit in your life. I'm going to prove it. I'm going to prove it to you. Okay, so what happens next? Next, we have Moses come along, and he has to what? He has to make Torah into a solid why? Because Israel has become so derelict of Abraham's practices. Remember, Abraham is the example. He's the father of all who believe, who are both circumcised and uncircumcised. And Paul then goes on to make a point that when a Gentile does the things of the law, they show themselves to be circumcised. And when a rabbi breaks the things of the law, then he shows himself to be uncircumcised. Gentile circumcised, not actually physically circumcised, but what? Having a inheritance in the covenant of Abraham. Gentile not circumcised, rabbi not circumcised, not physically, but what? Of the heart, and therefore what? Is in violation of Torah and therefore excludes himself from the promise of Abraham. Why? Because Abraham's example was keeping the law without it being written. And so the function, not dysfunction, of Abraham's lifestyle is based upon the Torah that was written upon his heart, which is actually the neshama, the breath of life, which creates what? The nefesh chayim, the living being, the living soul. Remember, the soul is in the blood. Remember, it says, don't drink the blood because the life is in the blood. Well, guess what it says in the Hebrew? The soul, the nefesh, is in the blood. In fact, when the flood wipes everybody out, it wipes out those who have the breath of life, the neshama and the ruach. Why? Because animals have the ruach in them, but they do not have the neshama in them. Okay, so looking in then to the function and dysfunction, limitation and lack of limitation and purpose and need, we have some new information about Elohim, right? Well, here's the part that's important. As we see this process coming down into a force of benefit, there's a point where it has to become a solid, where it actually is written upon the world of formation stone from that original intention way, 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 way up there. And remember, I've taught you that we have what? Love. God is love. Then we have love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then we have 4 commandments and we have 6 commandments, right? And then we have what? 613 commandments off of those that are like commentary on those 10. And then we have what? 1,024 that are commentary on those 613 when we equate in the New Testament and Paul's interpretation of those. And then we have what? 27 volume compendium of oral tradition, a 247 tenet compendium of bylaws and confessions, right? All equating to a whole bunch of solids at the bottom, written stuff instead of just simply love. But remember, that's falling through a bunch of filters as well. Why do we need to be told to love the Lord our God with all our soul, with all our mind, with all our heart? Is because we do not equate these two to actually be the same exact thing. So we never get to the God is love part. We have to go into the commandments, right? But as we go down in descendancy, we arrive at a solid. Well, here's the problem with that. Torah can't exist as a solid and have its ability to operate in a flexible manner that adjusts itself to the ebb and flow of the energy that follows the path of least resistance. You say, what did you just say? When Torah is a solid, it has limitations. Is it a force of benefit? Yes, absolutely. You cannot look at Torah and say, that commandment is bad or evil. Paul said so. He said, most certainly not. In fact, in the Hebrew, it's God forbid, or kas veshalom, right? Which is basically, let it never be, right? And so the premise is that in that process, what we are experiencing at that lowest level, so in the process of a solid, we're experiencing an absolute limitation and fence upon the existence of an Elohim. So what has to happen? Torah has to start to move from a solid back into a spirit in order for us to experience it correctly. Well, in its process from page to not so much of a page, an actual dynamic moving thing, into an ethereal presence, enter Yeshua. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled among us, came during the Feast of Tabernacles, right? And left during the Feast of Passover, a full cycle, right? And so in that process, it is very, very important to understand that Yeshua holds an experience of reality that we are not ready yet to understand. And that is that he was an absolute force of benefit. He was an evolution of a solid vibrating in a higher frequency that actually became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, the ascendancy and descendancy of Yeshua are present in an original intention of a force of benevolence upon what? All things that are created. And therefore, what we need to understand is that what Yeshua is going to bring to the table is the highest form of the intensification of all power in the universe. But I'm going to go a step further, and I'm going to say the highest form of the attributes of Yahweh. Now, when we get into the concept of Son, when we get into this concept of Father, we need to understand those are anthropomorphic assignments in order to help us understand the functional relationship between those energies. That's why the Trinity doctrine is so limiting. Okay? Now, when you get into, Wayne Grudem's concept of systematic theology, and he tries to scientifically explain the Trinity, again, we're running into a lot of problems because of this concept of emanation, ascendancy, descendancy, etc. And we again are trying to assign human attributes to the intensification of all power in the universe. We're trying to put limitations on that, right? We haven't even really been able to harness or contain or put a limitation around the sun, and we're trying to do it to the origin of all things. Okay, so in that, now we have an interesting concept. When we are dealing with Yahweh Elohim, there's a couple things we need to accept. Number one is that for whatever reason, and we don't really know the functional process of it, Moses is chosen to be the conduit, or the Elohim with a limitation that now has a purpose, of Torah. Remember, mouth to mouth communication between Moshe and Yahweh, to the extent that Torah is actually a dictation from Yahweh as Moshe writes it down. Okay? And so in that function, we need to understand that when we're passing all that through that filter, we need to accept that Moshe, who is partially a solid, actually is vibrating at an energy so high that when it comes time for him to have Torah and have all of these things go on with him, there's something very spiritual about the entire thing. But what we need to accept is that he wrote it down because of the dysfunction of humanity. The Jews chose, or I'm sorry, the Israelites chose to keep or not keep Torah, and eventually the Israelites became Judah. And Judah, or the Jews, chose to keep or not keep Torah, and therefore eventually becomes the Jews as we know them today. And so supposedly this is a Jewish law, except that Abraham was not circumcised, and according to the rabbis, was a Gentile, and according to the rabbis, was not actually a Hebrew or a Jew until he was circumcised. Well, that's not completely true. He was a Hebrew actually long before that. But the premise is that in general, what makes you Jewish is that you are a Shomer Torah, keeper of Torah, or you are circumcised, or you have bloodline, right? But what does Paul say? He is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart. A Gentile demonstrates himself to be a Jew by his actions, and that he doesn't actually have Torah written down in front of him and can study it and learn from the rabbis on how to keep it, but instead, just off of intuition, keeps the Torah and therefore shows himself to be obedient. How is that? Because the voice of Elohim is the breath of life. Therefore, you guys actually know Torah. Now, is it the written down words? No, it's a function of those, right? Those are a function of that breath of life and those intuitions. Because what? Because people choose not to listen to that intuition. We have the written compendium and eventually arrive at church bylaws, catechism, and Talmud traditions. And then we have, and really technically Talmud is a mess too, because all Talmud is the Mishnah, which was the oral Torah, with what the Gemara, which is what the commentary on the traditions, right? And then we have commentaries about that commentary. I don't want to get into it. Okay, so in that whole thing, we need to now look at this idea of the attributes of Yahweh. How does he identify himself? Okay, so there's a few ways in which he identifies himself, but the specific one that I want to look at, because there's a number of them, is actually going to be in Exodus chapter 33, I believe it is. Actually, we're going to go to Exodus chapter 34, verse 6. And I have it highlighted because it's some of my favorite stuff. And you actually have heard this. If you have been with us for a while, you have heard this before, except that it's going to have kind of a new life to it with this Elohim understanding. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go from this point of view right here. We're going to say, let's go with, New King James. And specifically, we are looking at this verse 6, Genesis chapter 34, verse 6. And it says, and Yahweh passed before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh Elohim, merciful and gracious. So remember, this is Yahweh's declaration of who he is to Moses, actual, like, if you need to know who I am, right? Okay, now, first of all, it says, and he cried out, or he called, or and he read. That could get intriguing in a midrash, but he says Yahweh. So he starts there, right? So this is what? This is the highest Elohim of the perceivable God. If we place any limitations on the intensification of all power in the universe, we arrive at Yahweh. Then he says Yahweh El, right? Which is what? Yahweh, the highest authority, right? El, remember an El? Remember an El is an authority, right? El is the clan leader, right? So he's saying Yahweh, the clan leader. And then what? Racham. Now, here's the intrigue. There are a number of other attributes that are mentioned here, okay, that have to do with chesed, truth. In fact, he says increasing chesed or intensifying chesed or mercy, all right? And also chanun or grace, chanan, right? Chanan or grace. So we have these attributes, right? Now, there is a sentiment, no, that's not it. There's an understanding that Torah operates of something called the law of first usage, okay? In other words, when the thing that is mentioned first has the highest priority. And that's why it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, because that's the most important thing you should ever know in your entire life, right? Yeah, well, when you get into the mysteries of it, sure, but on its face, it's not love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Because remember, all of Torah, even the stories, even the narratives, are instructional, telling you what to do. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth means we what? Need to do the same. Okay, that's another story as well. So in principle, then, what do we understand? If he lists something that it is going to go from greatest to least, okay? So in principle, we need to accept that the identity of Yahweh has to be understood in a very specific way, okay? And so when we are focusing on attributes, and they're mentioned in a specific priority, that means that there's something very important about what begins up here as the intention of benevolence and filters through down through here, somewhere passes through a limitation. Okay? So, that being the case, now what we need to do is we need to find out if there's a connection between the breath and the identity, right? Because a lot of people have this idea that if you do something in the name of something else, that somehow is equating to what? that somehow is like using the authority of a name in order to activate a process. But the truth is that when you operate in the name of something, you are operating within the breath of something, and I'll explain that in a minute. Why is it important? Well, because interestingly enough, when we get into the first attribute, we get into this word right here. So remember, we have Yahweh, and then we have Yahweh El, and then we have Racham, which is technically 3 names, okay? Or we could even potentially accept that Yahweh El Racham is 1, except that it says and here, okay? So Racham and Hanan, Erek, Ophim, Ve or and Rav, Chesed, and Emet. Okay, so his identity that he decides to communicate to Moses. Now remember, when Moses is like, who the heck are you, right? He starts with the highest form of a perceivable God that could ever exist, which is Ehya, which is what? I will exist. Not I am. I will exist, right? I will exist, that I will exist. That's literally what it says. Or better yet, I will be witnessed, that I will be witnessed. That would be a really, really good version of the interpretation of that. Or it could even say, I will establish a witness. But that's a whole nother story concerning Ehya versus Yahweh. And I know there's rabbis rolling over in their grave because I'm using those names. But the premise is that now, as he's talking to Moses, and as this is going on, he is actually what? He's bringing into existence the actual identifiable attributes of himself, right? He can swear by himself. He can brag about himself, which is what he's doing right now. However, not from an ego perspective, but instead letting him know what is the highest attribute of Yahweh. Okay? So, Yahweh Elohim, right, is now declaring to Moses, I am the clan leader. And then he begins to give these attributes, listing them one by one. But the first one is what? Racham. Racham, right here. So Rachum, sorry. And so that, of course, is an absolute. It's an adjective, right? Coming from what? The root racham, which is what? To love deeply, have mercy, or be compassionate. You know, I don't really like that definition. But you know, James Strong's did a lot of King James, shoving King James down the Hebrew language's throat. So let's see if we can't get past that a little bit. I'm going to copy the Strong's Concordance number, Racham. I'm going to go into the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, and specifically, we're going to search for that Strong's Concordance number, which will be mentioned in the lexicon, and then we will be closer to our answer, which consequently we have right here, right? Let's take a look at it. To have a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by misfortune and accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the suffering. Whoa. Well, first of all, I think we should probably go back and see what is the actual parent root here. Okay. So going back to the actual parent root, we will arrive at, it goes back a little ways here. We will arrive at this right here. All right. And here's our parent root. That PR, whoops, that PR indicates parent root, right? And we know the action is heat, right? But the concrete is cheese and the abstract is desire. Whoa, that's an interesting concept. Remember, desire or what? Need is what caused us to harness water and Elohim to begin with to promote life, because in the world of formation, which is partially spiritual and partially physical, how do we know? Because the neshama definitely was not something that he formed out of the dust of the ground or formed out of the air around him, but instead was the breath of life. He breathed the breath of life into the nostrils. So we know what? The world of formation has both spiritual and physical attributes, both of which can be harnessed and understood in ways that we yet have to understand. Okay? But here's desire, right? But having said that, let's talk a minute about this. So we've already encountered this word cham before, right? Cham is at the core of Hamas. It's at the core of Hamon. It's at the core of many other words. So the action of heat, let's talk about that for a moment. Generally speaking, the energy of heat is produced as a result of resistance. It can be air resistance. It can be surface resistance as a result of objects not really working with each other very well. And it can be the result of electrical resistance. And of course, proper use of electrical resistance in heat creates what? Light. Okay, so in principle, as energy is moving and resisted, it creates light. However, heat as a concept is actually something that is in a state of what? Of disorder, and is moving to a state of order by resistance. Okay. And so heat is a product of disorder moving to order. So in that thought process, the way we need to think about this is that they would have understood how heat worked as an action. Remember, this is the action of the parent root, the verb, heat, okay? But the concrete is cheese. So let's talk a minute about that. What is the big deal about cheese? Well, there's two very important elements. The first is that the way in which cheese is made actually equates to the science of everything involved with heat. Why? Because number one, you need heat to create the cheese curding process. Cheese curds were a delicacy, so much so that of all the things Abraham offered to Yahweh, who's the perceivable intensification of all power in the universe, when he visited him in Vayera, right, and he appeared, which is going to be Genesis chapter 18, he offers him cheese curds and the fatted calf or veal, right? So what we were with veal parmesan, that's what he decided to serve Yahweh. Okay. Having said that, the principle is that now what we have is we have a separation between what? The water and the cheese curds. Why is that important? Because the chet and mim are what make up this word. So let's jump over to the board for a minute and let's take a look at this. Let's document what we're learning here. Okay. So first and foremost, I think it's important that we document this cham, right? Cham, which is basically, it is the, let's see, what am I going to do here? Let's do blue. Okay. And so what do we have? We have the tent wall, right? Which we'll talk about in a little bit. And we have water, right? And so in general, the tent wall means separate, right? And we know that this means water, but technically means disorder. We won't get too far into that at the moment. So what is this concept of separate water or separate water? Well, when you are making cheese curds, the milk is put into a cheese skin or a cheesecloth, and then it's placed near heat, and the whey drips out of the cheesecloth, leaving the curds or the cottage cheese. And as that is influenced by heat more, it kind of starts to become more of a solid, more of a solid, more of a solid, and less of a liquid. The whey is then drank like kefir, right? But the cheese curds itself is actually little curds of cheese. Okay. Now, the reason why this process is important is because once the water is separated from the cheese, this becomes a delicacy or a delight, which our Hebrew word chametz, right, means to delight in, right? So when we are dealing with that concept of chametz, we are dealing with this idea of delighting in something, then we can understand where that concept comes from. However, remember, we are dealing with what? Love, I guess, or mercy is kind of how it's translated in the English. Recall what I read at the beginning of our journey into this lexical definition, right? Which we're going to talk about in a minute, because it seems as though that doesn't necessarily jive. So what I'm going to do, we'll just go ahead and go back to, actually, you know what? Let me do this first. Let's go ahead and do the definitions really quick. So the pictograph is a picture of a wall, meaning to separate. The picture mem is of water. Combine these means separate water. Cheese was made by placing milk in a bag made out of an animal skin. The bag was hung out in the sun and pushed back and forth. The skin of the bag contained an enzyme that, when heated and shaken, caused the milk to sour and separate into its parts: fat, curds or cheese, and water, whey. The whey would be drunk and the curds eaten or stored for future consumption. So in general, we say that cham is the heat from the sun, right? Right here. Cham is the heat from the sun, right? And it heats the contents of the bag that creates the cheese curds. But we were all the way actually over here. And if we go back to our search, we can jump right to it. We have what? We have racham. The bowels are the seat of compassion. Okay, so let's talk about this a minute. I don't feel like my bowels are the seat of compassion. Okay, we've heard of bowels of mercy, and we've heard of the innermost being. We've heard of the heart being the liver. We have all these different weird ways in which the Hebrews seem to have operated. Now, a couple things I need to say, and the first one is that when we deal with the evolution of language, and when we are dealing with the evolution of cultures and civilizations, we have a tendency to forget that the evolution of our culture and civilization as American Protestant Christians is a Western Roman based system that is based upon the Hellenization of the Western Roman Empire versus the Eastern mystic influence of the Eastern Roman Empire and that conflict. Well, let's be reminded that in all of that process, Alexander the Great conquered India. India is technically the land of the Hindus, as it were. And Hindus are a very misunderstood people because there is a lot of stuff that has come into play where, again, we have oral traditions, bylaws, solids, right, written down that may or may not contain that original force of benefit that is present in every single human being. Why do I bring up India? Well, if you look at the actual attributes of the human body medically, we find that there are certain centers on the body that exist as influential centers upon the body. For example, the thyroid gland is present here, right, in the throat, but it controls parts of the body that have nothing to do with the throat, right? And so, like, for example, when we deal with the pineal gland or we deal with the reproductive organs, right, the ovaries or testes, then we start to get into the idea of there being a delight or passion. Now, why do I bring that up? Why do I bring Hindu up? Because they actually have established a science of studying those centers and assigning subtle or spiritual attributes to those centers. Now, of course, for you scary Christians, as soon as I say this word, you're going to turn it off, or I'm going to get comments, which is chakras. Now, in general, when we're dealing with chakras, then all of a sudden people get scary with the Kundalini energy and the demonic and all this other stuff. But the truth is that you have within you these centers. Now, when I was trained in martial arts, I was trained that if you strike the solar plexus, you, in the physical realm of that strike, actually create a nerve storm within the body that is so intense and destructive that it actually stuns the attacker right in their step, literally paralyzing them for a split second. And anybody who's ever been hit in the solar plexus will know that that also has what? The diaphragm there. And that diaphragm, when it is struck, will knock the breath out of you. The breath, right? So now all of a sudden we say, okay, well, what's the subtle element here? Or what's the spiritual element here? And we realize that that is actually one of the spiritual centers of existence. So now when we go back into our bowels of mercy, remember, the intensification of all power in the universe does not have bowels, right? But instead what we have is we have this function of reality that we have to assign attributes to in order for it to work. But why the bowels, right? Well, we have that process or this idea of something welling up from below and coming out, right? And so we have this idea of the bowels of mercy being what? A lower Elohim, or a interpreter of information, right? From that original benevolent statement. So why do I bring up the chakras? Well, in its simplicity, we can say that there is a passion present in the lower energy centers of the body. Now, when we're dealing with passion, in a Hebrew sense, we have to work with what we have in front of us, and therefore we have to kind of get a bit graphic. The word passion in Hebrew is related to the name David, okay? And recall, the name David has to do with the female breasts. The reason this is important is because there's a energy present within a female here that projects outward, letting a male know that they are welcome, or it will be closed and prevent them from coming near them. And you can actually feel that energy. You can actually experience that energy. Call it what you will, but you know when a man is allowed in and when he's not, right? So passion has something to do with attraction, but also passion has something to do with the breath, right? Okay, so the reason why that's important is because we know that passion as a system of reproduction is excited by the passion that's present here in the chest of a woman, okay, or a male, right? And so when we are dealing with this idea of something welling up from below, we know that that passion or that desire for connection and for the intent of reproduction, again, Paul said, was a way to know our God, a way to understand his what? Invisible attributes, divine nature, and eternal power. So why is that so important? Well, when we're dealing with Racham and the bowels being the seat of compassion, we now understand it has nothing to do with your colon, right? But it has to do with where it's welling up from and why, right? Passion or compassion is based upon heat coming off of the chest of a woman, etc. Okay, so now when we're dealing with this, we're now going to be looking at this from the point of view of what it means to have compassion, to have a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by misfortune, accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the suffering. It is important to understand that when we're dealing with relationship, a positive conditional regard is present. You say, oh no, I have absolute unconditional positive regard for my spouse, or I have unconditional positive regard for my children. No, because the moment that some stimulus presents as malevolence, we instantaneously already begin to move away from discomfort, and therefore the opposite of relationship. Remember, relatianis, the what? The repeated lateral movement towards. So now we have a repeated lateral movement away from, right? And so the more that occurs, the more that we experience malevolence and discomfort from that malevolence, we have a tendency to move away from. Therefore, there's no such thing as unconditional positive regard. And from that point of view, now we need to understand that we have a conditional positive regard that causes us to stay in relational interaction. So if that's true, then we need to understand that there is then a movement or a tendency to move away from discomfort and away from malevolence. But remember that Elohim are receiving information, communicating it to a higher Elohim based upon desire. What is desire? A deficit in a vessel of reception. What does that mean? Remember last week I taught you that if it's emptied out, now there's a space. You create the space. You create the space, and now here comes this thing, a higher Elohim or a greater, pouring out into the lesser, and therefore now there's a state of reception, and therefore there is a receiving. That is important because desire communicates to the upper realms what needs to be poured out. Okay. And of course, we have 8 billion-ish people all having a very unique and different fingerprint desire, and that all communicating and reconciling. And of course, there's all kinds of energy signals canceling each other out. This person's praying for it, this person's praying against it, and somehow in the middle they're reconciling each other, and that communication is eventually arriving up at the higher Elohim, and they are then pouring out. Okay, so in that breath, we need to understand that information that is communicated to the highest Elohim is passing through the information that was already contained in the intensification of all power in the universe. Why is that important? Because now, when we go back to the board and we add our resh, and we add this premise of the resh, we have what? A human head, right? And this is no relation to anybody who you may know, if there's any likeness. Okay, we have a human head, and that human head then is what? Rosh, or mind, or man, depending on how we look at it, because sometimes it's like man outside, that's ruach, right? That's rach. Okay, so why is this important? Well, now what we have is we have racham, we have the resh, the chet, and the mim, we have the chet in the middle. Now here is the intrigue. The resh is in the place of honor, and therefore does a work upon the parent root in some way, okay? But the parent root itself is separate water, right? And so what's intriguing here is that if we were to deal with this in terms of its metaphorical or its poetic definition, what we're dealing with here is disorder. And so literally what this says is man is separate from disorder, or the mind is separate from disorder. And this is the word in English, compassion. Now, what does come do to the word passion? Where does that come from? Well, let's take a look at the etymological dictionary and see what we can find out, okay? So, jumping over into our etymological dictionary, compassion, a feeling of sorrow or deep tenderness for one who is suffering or experiencing misfortune. Mid 14th century, right? Which is around the 1500s, which could potentially be connected with the Protestant Reformation, but we don't know that. And we have what? Compassion, or no, we have compassion, literally a suffering with another. From the Old French compassion or sympathy or pity, compassion, which is going to be 12th century. From the late Latin compassionem, nominative compassio, sympathy, noun of state from past participle stem of compatir, to feel pity, from cum, to be with, okay? So where we get our word pity, right? And then adding the cum to it. Many people actually take offense to the concept of pity. But in general, if we are in a state of helplessness, we desire it. Remember, desire is an emptiness that communicates to the upper Elohim to pour out. And intrigue here is what? That pity is the process by which something is poured out. In that sense, let's talk about mercy and grace in order to really understand the function of compassion in the sense of racham versus chanan versus favor, right? Or delight. Okay, so the first thing that you need to know or understand is that when it says, if I have found favor in your eyes, if I have given you delight, is directly related to the cheese curds. That's chametz, right? That's that idea of a person experiencing delight. All right. Now, when we're dealing with that thought process, you need to understand that that is related to the original word, right? That is the that is the original concept or the idea of that delightful cheese curd, right? That's that principle there. And so when we are dealing with that sentiment of delight or finding favor, what we're dealing with is, have I met the need, right, of your desire to feel pleasure, right? If I have somehow caused you to feel pleasure, well, how does a higher Elohim feel pleasure? How does a lower Elohim give a higher Elohim pleasure? By what? By elevating them, acknowledging their title, but also what? Receiving, right? You can't give to a higher Elohim because you don't have the wherewithal to give. And therefore, what we do give is we receive and therefore give pleasure to the thing, because what is pleasure? Pleasure is satisfaction of desire, right? So if the higher Elohim has a desire to give and we receive, we've given that higher Elohim pleasure. Well, the reason why this is so important is because when we get into the idea of pleasure versus grace, we have an interesting concept. In ancient times, the clan leader would have all of the people in the clan line their tents around in some sort of shape that had all of the exterior walls of the tents touching each other, and created what we call the continuous wall. Now, the continuous wall is a combination of the letter chet and the letter nun being wall continuous. Outside of that wall were positioned watchmen to prevent a marauder from cutting through that exterior wall and creating a breach in the wall, and therefore no longer having the protection of it. And therefore, grace as an understanding is, of course, what? That continuous wall. If you are in grace, that means that you are in the clan, which means that you are obedient to the clan leader. It means that you are what? Protected by the clan leader, provided by the clan leader, and instructed by the clan leader. And as long as that's true, you exist in the clan. The moment that you demonstrate that you're not actually part of the clan, just like the guy who didn't have the wedding garment on, you are thrown out of the clan. And being thrown outside of the clan means you are exposed to the marauders, to the desert, to a lack of provision, protection, and instruction. Therefore, when we're dealing with grace, what we are dealing with is the concept or the idea of a tent wall. When we're dealing with chesed, which is mercy, we're dealing with a whole nother animal. Why? Because mercy itself only exists if there's a presence of guilt. Mercy is a mitigation or a reduction on the fullest extent of the punishment that could probably be had. The reason why chesed or mercy is so important in this factor is because you need to understand there's a difference between being guilty of something and needing someone to be merciful and reduce sentence as a result of that gentleness of heart, as it were, and someone, whether they're guilty or not guilty, falling into calamity and you feeling that suffering with them and having a strong desire to deliver them from it. Remember, desire creates the space for an upper Elohim to give. Okay? Desire is the actual emptiness or missing of something, and therefore the upper Elohim pouring out. Remember, you have to give in order to receive, right? And so that principle then equates to this idea that Raham is a strong desire to separate the human from the disorder. Okay. So notice what I said. When we're dealing with grace, we are dealing with some conditional processes, right? Some conditional processes that you have to adhere to stay in the camp. You need to understand it is the action of the clan leader to deliver you from violence, right? Because delivering from violence is the actual word salvation, Yasha, where we get the name Yeshua. Remember, Yeshua means to remove from danger violently. And in the ancient pictographic Hebrew parent root, it's destroyer watches. What destroyer? The one who would destroy the predator who would attack the sheep. The one who absolutely will come down with all heaven and earth against the one who would what? Be willing to attack the sheep, right? Okay, so destroyer watches becomes remove violently, like tearing the sheep from the predator's mouth and breaking the skull of the predator with a rod in order to destroy the predator, right? And then what? And then the sheep has become delivered, which is another Hebrew word, not yasha, okay? Why is that so important? Because you need to understand that when it says we are saved by grace, it is the intention of the clan leader to protect its sheep. My sheep hear my voice. Not all people hear the shepherd, and not all, right? There was that principle of only those who he called would hear, right? But then also there's the premise that something else might call and it's not his voice. And then there's also the premise that there's some who would hear the voice and not call. That was his whole discussion about the word of God and it falling on dry ground or the birds eating in it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So now we start to get into the subtle idea that the word racham is what? That is to separate the head from the chaos. Separate the head from the disorder, right? Used it one more time for your sakes. So the premise is that what we're dealing with here when we're dealing with disorder is something that's following the path of least resistance that has no limitations upon it. So how do we separate the man or the head, the mind, from the disorder? We create a limitation. And that limitation then becomes what? A function of purpose. So as disorder is occurring within the mind, we create a limitation that causes it to flow in its correct way. Now you can understand where we could get into the laying on of hands. We could get into the process of connecting the subconscious and the conscious mind in order to have a greater awareness of ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. However, it is very, very important to understand that when you observe suffering, remember that I've already done this part of the teaching. When you observe suffering, you experience that suffering with that one, and thereby what? Have a strong desire to what? To deliver them from it. Okay, that's Racham. That's the concept here. And so what are we looking at? We're looking at moving someone from their discomfort or their experience of malevolent energies into benevolent energies through the action of separating the mind from the disorder. Well, that's intriguing, because if we think of disorder now as the word that it's used in modern times as being psychological abnormalities or dysfunction of organs in the body, we begin to accept that that was the premise to begin with. That there is this process of Elohim operating without limitation, and that limitation now needs to come into order. Well, here's the intrigue on that. One could argue that the only way in which an Elohim is operating outside of its limitations is if it is not listening to those limitations. And here's the intrigue. What if those limitations are inappropriate? Now we have two problems. The first problem is if an Elohim is going outside of its limitations, and those limitations are a force of benefit, which we call Torah. The second is if an Elohim has experienced the limitation that's the result of some other force operating against it, and therefore limiting it from operating in its fullest potential or purpose. Remember, every Elohim is trying to flow, and every Elohim is following the path of least resistance. If there is a positive resistance, then there's a harnessing. Maybe positive isn't the right word. A benevolent resistance, then there's a harnessing of that power within that Elohim, which creates purpose. But if we are dealing with an Elohim that is operating outside of its limitations, and those are benevolent, then it is operating in disorder again. And if it's operating in disorder, then it is not operating within the natural order processes and creating a disruption in the harmonic balance of what? The corporate collective conscience, as it were, but also a harmonic balance with all of creation, because every single thing is some form of an Elohim. So when we are dealing with the idea that the intensification of all power in the universe is emanating into all these different solids, right? Emanating into rocks, trees, flowers, etc. Can we observe in nature a natural harnessing of an Elohim that would create purpose? Well, the answer is yes. If the Aretz, which is dry ground, is resisting the Elohim of Mayim, which is water, which is something that Yahweh said to Job, where were you when I created a limitation for the water? Now we understand why we have rivers, which are the reason why we can harness water. Now we understand why we have water following the path of least resistance. And now we understand how Elohims can interact with each other as a force of benefit for lower Elohims, and that those lower Elohims can interact with each other to what? Benefit Elohims who are vibrating at a lower form of energy. What do I mean by that? I mean that you need to understand that every single human being has the potential to be effective. Every single human being has the breath of life, or neshama, within them. And if that's true, then Torah is written upon their hearts. And sometimes they just need a space created that will give them a place to be nudged into Torah, right? Into the true force of benefit from the intensification of all power in the universe, which consequently had to go all the way down to a solid, right? Written on stone to flesh and be dynamic, moving, and able to what? Able to adapt. But remember, Yeshua as an Elohim has all of the attributes, all of the information, all of the power of the intensification of all power in the universe, and therefore what? Has as his identity, and therefore as his guide, and therefore as his principle, Racham, a associating or a connection with, and I shouldn't say associating, because the truth is the opposite of Racham is disassociation, but the opposite of disassociation with Racham has nothing to do with association, but instead has to do with a connection, right? And that connection is that experiencing that pain with the other person and having a strong desire to remove them from it. But remember what I said, every human has the potential to be effective. What is preventing them from being effective is their wounds, which is informational systems creating a distorted, deleted, and over generalized reality of identity within that person, limiting beliefs, which is false limitations, preventing an Elohim from operating in its true potential, right? Something pretending to be Torah, right, is a limiting belief. And then entitlements, which is what? A false understanding of the elevation of an Elohim. Someone calling themselves general when they have no rank, or someone operating in a place where they have no authority, right? And what happens? The earth removes that one. Remember, the earth cannot bear a servant exceeding its master, right? And so in principle, then, as we look at that, the lesser can never exceed the greater. If it ever does, then it will be brought down by what? The Aretz itself. The actual universe will operate against that one. Okay, and so in the grand scheme of things, then the way that we look at this is we look at the actual operational definition, which is what? To suffer with and desire to deliver from, right? And remember in my last message when I talked about Racham, which you could see, these are all highlighted. So this is stuff we've touched upon before. But the principle is that when I spoke about it before, I said, look, you can absolutely call fire down from heaven upon a malevolent energy. However, when that energy falls into suffering, it is absolutely necessary that you be the one to desire a deliverance of that one. I remember one time, a long time ago, I was praying for my daughter. And I said, Abba, I want her to know everything that I am teaching, everything that you are teaching me, everything that I am learning. I have this strong desire that she know. Maybe it's because I have built into me this parent. Maybe it's because of all of the precious things that have ever been created. That one was created by me, and therefore I have a desire for that creation to experience what I have experienced in blessing, in abundance, in emotional stability and mental health, etc., etc. I said, but I don't want her to go through what I've been through. I don't want her to suffer the way I've suffered. I don't want her to experience the magnitude of pain that was the catalyst for change in my reality. And I felt like the answer that came back was, then how do you ever expect her to value it? And that's when I realized I could not pray a prayer that was for her benefit, that she would know what I know, without praying for her suffering. I couldn't bring myself to do it because I didn't understand it that way back then. Now, today, I think it would probably be easier because I know what the outcome would be, right? Let me make something clear. Desire overrides desire. Your strongest desire, no matter how much you blurt out your mouth of what you supposedly want, your strongest desire is what actually calls to the Elohim above. And that's what they will deliver. Okay? So however much you want to gack, bump your gums about what you think you want or what you say you want or what you pretend you want, the intensification of all power in the universe is not responsive to your yak, but to your thump. Okay. And so I think it is very important to understand that when we're dealing with desire and satiation of that desire creates pleasure, right? So it says satiety of hunger creates the pleasure of what? Fullness, which is what? Chai in the Hebrew understanding. The full belly is life, right? And so when we are dealing with the desires, we need to understand that your strongest ones are actually what will come into play in your reality, not what you say. So if you pray and you should be like, Lord, please help such and such, you know, come through this surgery okay. But in your heart of hearts, either A, you don't care, you're completely indifferent to or disassociated from their suffering because it's not your friend and not your cousin and not your grandma, then you have an indifference to that. Don't even pray. Don't say you will pray because you won't. And when I say you won't, your heart won't. It's when we experience that moment. So let's say that somebody's been in this horrible ordeal where maybe they had let's say it was a home invasion. That's a good one because there's a lot of factors of post-traumatic stress that go into that, right? Now, all of a sudden, every time you go into your home, you wonder if you're safe, right? So let's say that we're dealing with that. Someone has experienced a home invasion. Now they don't know whether they're safe or not, because obviously home invasion, when you have all those security thoughts in place that make you think you're safe, you're not, right? Now someone else comes along and says, man, I had a home invasion and I just feel like I can't live where I'm at. And now you're 2 or 3 years away from it, or maybe you're just a few days away from it. You can suffer with that person and have a strong desire for them to be delivered. And guess what the reciprocation is? Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. The reciprocation of compassion upon another is that you will experience compassion. And so, in a weird sort of way, when you say, I have a strong desire to deliver this person from this pain, you'll be delivered from pain. And so here we go with giving to receive, right? And so that premise or that idea that is operating as a function of an Elohim within you when it comes to Racham has to do with your ability to connect to the pain, which means if you haven't had a relative who's had an addiction, you probably can't pray for somebody who has an addiction unless you had an addiction. And so what does that mean? That means like kind attracts like kind. You are going to attract to yourself who you are truly supposed to pray for, but also you are going to attract to yourself those who need their minds delivered from the disorder. Remember, light or is the process of order, and light is a strong mind. Remember, evil is a twisted rope and a human head. Meaning what? Mind twists. A weak mind is somebody who allows their reality to be twisted or twists their reality to something that is false. Remember, I said in the sermon a number of weeks ago, we're all fake. and here's why, and here's how. That's the premise. But now let's talk about this idea that the intensification of all power in the universe is present within us with limitations placed upon it. Then that means that as we work our way back up the ladder, that information is still present, meaning Racham is present at the first principle. Racham is present at that first Elohim, but Racham is also present in Yahweh, which is the perceivable attribute of the intensification of all power in the universe. And therefore, that means that it is what? It is an attribute, but also itself an Elohim. And if it's itself an Elohim, and it is a greater, then it is an authority over all the lessers, then that means that Racham is actually an authority and therefore a guide that gives us provision, protection, and instruction. And so then we need to accept that Racham is a commandment, but is also an entity to be honored. And in that way is a father or teacher. Remember, the rabbis would accept that some people would call them father or rabbi. What's rabbi? So we got Av, right? Abba, right? We call a rabbi Abba. Why? Because we're acknowledging that we are their adopted son. Remember, Paul sat at the feet of Gamaliel when he was a child. He sat at the feet of, as in he was adopted by Gamaliel, and we'll call him father. And then, of course, rabbi is what? Rabbi is my great one, but really what it means is somebody who is increased or intensified in knowledge. And therefore, saying that, calling somebody a rabbi is saying, I acknowledge your intensity of knowledge versus mine, right? Teach me, show me, guide me. And that's what, when Paul says, you claim that you're a guide to the blind, but do you rob temples, right? He's talking to the rabbis saying, look, guys, there's a way in which you're supposed to be a rabbi. And of course, people have it confused in Matthew chapter 23, verse 8, where he says, call no man rabbi. That's not what it says. But the principle is that we are not supposed to desire to be entitled that, or be given that given that title, but instead that title be given to us. And so in principle, our attributes will earn that title, right? And so the premise is that when we are dealing with rendering honor to a rabbi like Racham, right? When we're dealing with Racham as a teacher, as an instructor, as an authority, and we're dealing with it as a father, because remember, Yahweh is Racham, but Racham itself is a separate entity that is also Yahweh, but is not Yahweh, right? Because it is also an attribute of Yahweh. Then we understand then that it is also a father, and therefore we are sons of compassion, right? That's one attribute of Yahweh that we are sons of, because we are sons of God, right? B'nai Elohim. And so in principle, then we can accept that the highest authority in the universe is Racham. The highest authority in the universe is a strong desire to deliver, or an ability to suffer with, and a strong desire to deliver from, and also is the separating of the mind from the disorder. The separating of the man from the disorder. So in principle then, if Racham is the highest attribute, because remember, Yahweh listed that one first when he declared his titles to Moshe. When Moshe was trying to understand Yahweh on another level than just mouth to mouth, and Yahweh was like, okay, well, you can look into the information and see what is available, and that information that I give you is going to be what you will understand about me, what he was saying is not only is it my filter, before it ever hits my mind, it will pass through Racham. But also it is the lesser of me and therefore an authority over you, but also it is going to be sending me information as a result of the deficits that it pours out into everything else. And so as a result of that, it causes him to take action to us. Because remember, all prayer is desire. No words that you say could ever accomplish what your heart is able to do just by pulling in, creating the space and pulling in. Okay. And so in principle, then as we begin to understand this, then we accept that Racham is an authority to be obedient to, then that means that we somehow need to get our minds wrapped around suffering with and desiring deliverance. It doesn't say we deliver them. It says we desire their deliverance by suffering with them. So how do you suffer with somebody who you actually have not experienced that suffering? I would say you don't, but here's the intrigue. Like kind attracts like kind. You will attract to yourself those who are suffering and things that you have suffered from. And remember, your suffering or your adversity will become your strength, and that will become your purpose, because what is limiting you now is actually harnessing the Elohim within you to become this magnanimous process of intensification of energy that is going to actually change this universe, change this world. You are the change that this world needs, but remember, it is your adversity that is bringing you into the strength that will cause you to be an Elohim of the greater level instead of an Elohim of the lesser level. And that greater Elohim will what? Will Yeshua deliver, violently tear out of the mouth of the predator the sheep, and will what? Create a space by which they are safe and therefore delivered. And in that process, you're just a part of a greater scheme of all of this other cosmic energies and processes that are occurring. And remember, at the core of this entire thing is this malevolent energy of pain being a catalyst for change, but that pain is the result of someone else creating a social injustice. And that social injustice is a violation or a sin against what? Against Torah, which is what? The breath of God, which is your natural flowing existence. Torah is the most natural path of Elohim. Anything other than Torah is without covenant. In the Greek, hamartia means to be without covenant, right? And so if you are without covenant, then you are no longer in the protection of the clan leader. And if you are without covenant, then you yourself are going to fend for yourself. And fending for yourself in a place that's 99% darkness and 1% light, you are going to be a very diminished version of that 1%. You're going to be like 1.000000001 as opposed to the person that's almost 1.99999999999. Remember, we can't ever get to the 2% without elevation, and that would be a whole nother discussion and a whole nother existence. But the premise is between 1 and 2 is a lot of space in our world of reality, in our world of service, and in our world of Racham. You know, I've thought a lot about this, and there's an element of benevolence present in this generation, that there's a concept within our reality of tolerance. Tolerance for some really weird stuff. Tolerance for things that maybe the generation before that generation really wouldn't necessarily accept as a reality, but unfortunately, in this day and age, has a reality to it. Are there limitations? Are there frustrations? Are there people who are reactive to those thought processes? Yes, sure. But within the realm of the societal tolerance that's present is an allowance for you to identify, right, who you are. And people tolerate that identity. Well, you are Elohim. Or if we were to go into Christianese, you are gods. And if you are gods, just according to what Yeshua said in John chapter 10, during Hanukkah of all things, you need to accept and understand that that comes with responsibility. Gods do God things. They don't do human things. Okay. And humans do human things. And so as a result of that is operating within the proper identity. Remember, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God, which is the absolute highest attribute of the intensification of all power in the universe, which means you already have been given an identity that is higher than any Elohim that exists. And yet we still operated within our wounds, our limiting beliefs, our entitlements, and a lack of imagination. And in that process, don't operate with an identity that would be totally accepted right now. And interestingly enough, if it actually was accepted as an identity and we did operate within it, we would demonstrate that we are the change that this world needs. We would be doing something different than what Christianity has done for the last, 1,500 years. And in that process, we also have this idea that Yeshua already demonstrated. Here's the intrigue. There's a lot of people over time who have gained the reputation as master. What is a master? A master is somebody who has exceeded in knowledge, understanding, or authority, right? Knowledge, understanding, wisdom, authority, money, etc., and is able to be a steward of it, right? That's a master. Now, we're not talking about slaves and masters here. We're talking about somebody who's a master of something, like a master of martial arts or whatever. In that mastery, there are those who have a reputation that their mastery exceeded their life, and that when they left such a legacy that people to this day still adhere to it. For example, Buddha, or some other influential character in history. And Yeshua has that same reputation, right? Christ, Christian, right? People have continued to try to follow in his footsteps. Unfortunately, we have the Western Roman Empire prevailing over the Eastern Roman Empire. And so any Eastern mystic principles or metaphysical principles present in Christianity were snuffed out. And in that process became a logic-based religion that has nothing to do with the breath of life within you that already has given you the instruction and how to interact with another human being, and whose highest authority is Racham. Torah's highest authority is compassion. So much for the law being a burden, right? Who here thinks that Torah has been done away with when its highest authority and its highest intention is compassion? You're commanded to be compassionate. Guess what? Christ did not deliver you from that law. Okay? And so in that way, because we can't cherry pick, the law's done away with or it's not. In that sense, it is important to understand that if that's an Elohim, and if that is a father, and that is a rabbi, that is a teacher who has more knowledge than you, then you seek it as a higher spiritual guide. You desire it as a stronger intuition through intention. That's right. You want to be, or desire to be, more compassionate. And if you desire to be more compassionate, then that's going to be answered. But it has to be stronger than those wounds, has to be stronger than those limiting beliefs, has to be stronger than those entitlements, right? Oh, I have a right. No, you don't. But I'll bet you if you desired it correctly, you'd receive it, right? And so in that whole concept of he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God, we have an identity that in this day and age, if I walk around saying I'm a God, that's accepted. and then I demonstrate that I'm a God, then guess what? I will what? I will be able to operate in the path of least resistance. Why is that important? Because then when we start to get into identity and we start to understand that people change, and when they change, along with their change becomes a very different human being, a very different way of thinking, a very different way of operating, then there's a point in time where we have to tolerate and let that happen. Here's the intrigue. If you create a space and a tolerance and allow something that is not supposed to exist in the realm of the natural order processes of the universe, you know the earth is going to tear it down if it's not supposed to be elevated. But we're so busy trying to prevent it from being elevated that it gets to just exist. In the same way, if you were to actually allow yourself to be elevated into the position that you're supposed to be in and operate within that position, amazing things would happen. How many times have you felt unworthy of a title that people attempted to give you? How many times have you felt unworthy of a position that people attempted to give you? A responsibility that people attempted to give you? It's that same principle. It's that same concept. But at the core of it all is an understanding that suffering is pain. Pain is the catalyst for change. Now, here's the intrigue. You create a space. You create a space for that to occur, and all of a sudden, that is going to be received. And so, when we're dealing with compassion, we're not actually delivering the person per se, right? But instead, we're creating a space by which they could be delivered by desiring their deliverance. Now, I'm going to personally say that there are people in existence in my reality who I really don't want to do that for. Even though that I know that they were operating out of their wounds, even though I know that they were suffering and therefore they are in a state of wounds, limiting beliefs, and entitlements, there is a part of me that says, I do not want to create that space for them to be delivered. I want them to suffer because I still am a human being. And one of the things that I love about myself is that I am willing to accept that there are certain things that I have yet not grown in, but I am hopeful that I will grow in. So instead, I'm going to have to create a desire to have compassion, right? Which gives us a very interesting insight into all this, that sometimes you have to create a desire to create a desire to create a desire to create a desire. So it begins with an intention. So what's my intention? Do I want to be a more compassionate person? I do. And so as a result of that, I am going to do something that is absolutely outlandish. I am going to operate within the Shem, or the power of a Shem. What's a Shem? A Shem is a name, okay? Now, let's say that we talk about, for example, when Yeshua says, though if 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, so there am I, and we instantaneously attach that as long as the name of Jesus is on our breath, then all of a sudden he's also there, but that's not what's going on there. The word Sham itself has some intriguing elements to it. Now, I know this one is going a little bit long, but I want to share this one last thing with you to set an example, okay? And so what I'm going to do here is we're just going to go to the word name in the Blue Letter Bible, okay? So real simple, I'm just going to type in the word name. Okay, and of course it's going to pop up the first usage of it. The name of the first was Pishon, right? And then we'll jump over there real quick. Just jump over to our word name. And like I said, I'm going to run through this pretty quick. So now we're to the word Sham, right? Which means name, Sham, right? to name something, to establish an observable uniqueness, as it were, right? Coming from the word shum, through the idea of definite or conspicuous position. This means to put in place or to set or to make, as in to set up or place. This is like placing a boundary stone, et cetera, et cetera. But let's get our Strong's Concordance numbers. It's going to take us directly to a root. Okay? A root. Okay? And so here is what we have going on. We have this word sham, right? Parent root sham, breathe, breath, and abstract desolate. The wind or breath of someone or something is its character, right? Hebrew names are words given to describe the character of the individual or place. A word given to an individual or place denoting its character, the character of an individual or place, right? Okay, so now you understand that the word name in Hebrew does not mean the like identifiable uniqueness of a human being, but instead the character. Now, oftentimes people would name their children because of the character that they perceived was already present within them when they observed them for those 8 days before they got their circumcision, or a guidance from some higher place giving them that name, or a choosing of that name based upon the family itself. Okay. So when I received my Hebrew name, Kinatavnu, it was a result of the change that had occurred in me. It was a result of the difference between who I was versus who I am. When I identify myself as Rabbi Q, I'm identifying myself as that title that was given to me by someone else, right? Not that I desired, but was given to me by someone else. And the first letter of my Hebrew name. My Hebrew name, Kivin Tavnu, means with zeal, I will build us. But there's no last name attached to that. And so as a result of that, I decided that since that's the highest Elohim, the highest attribute of Yahweh, the highest teacher, the highest rabbi that was manifest in my Rabbi Yeshua, I want to be called by that name. And so in the process of the reputation that I desire to have, not that I have now, because I don't have that attribute within me, I really, really, really don't want to have compassion on some of the dark people in my life. I now have what? I have to create a desire to have compassion. And so as a result of that, the way that I'm going to manifest that as an example for you is my new name is Kinatavnu ben Racham. That's right. I'm naming myself. Get over it. And I'm naming myself because that's a desire that I want to have so that I can what? Be a more compassionate person. And so my full name now is Kinatavnu ben Racham. Kinatavnu, son of Racham, son of compassion. So for those of you who are on YouTube, I will go ahead and say Shabbat Shalom. And for those of you who are actually going to be participating in the Midrash, we'll need a second to set up. For those of you who are leaving from the Midrash, Shabbat Shalom. And